Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, can I first start by thanking the Vice-Chancellor for inviting me to give the 2012 Oxford-London lecture on population ageing, and therefore being able to show some of the work that we're doing at the Institute of Population Ageing and indeed across Oxford in this area. And can I also thank James Martin and Lillian Martin, who is with us tonight, and Dame Vivian Duffield for their very generous support of the Institute and for much of the research that you're going to hear tonight. And a third thank you has to be to my two senior colleagues, Kenneth House and George Leeson. Kenneth is a philosopher and George is a mathematician, and when you combine that with anthropology, I can say that over the last 10 years, we've had the most stimulating discussions, and they have very much framed a lot of my thinking. So thank you. Population has indeed become a subject of considerable interest. I think many of you may be aware that last year on October the 31st, the UN designated that day to be the day when the world hit 7 billion. And I did quite a lot of press that day and during the preceding week, and I did a BBC interview, and there, live on air, the BBC interviewer said, how do we know? How do we know that today the 7th billion baby will be born? And I think that shows two things. One, that there is currently a lot of interest around the fact that we have a population that is growing. But secondly, there's a tremendous amount of inaccurate information and false beliefs out there. Clearly, the 7th billion baby was not born that day. It was a symbol, an important symbol, but one that just represented one part of the way that our population is changing. It's not just growing, it's also changing in its density. We're becoming far more urban. It's changing in its distribution. We're becoming more mobile. And it is changing in its composition. We are becoming older. And that is because of an age structural change. Let's call it the age transition, by which, due to fertility and mortality changes, the world is shifting in its age structure. And it's that, in particular, that I want to talk to you tonight, and that's particularly the focus of the Institute. When I was a student in demography some 30 years ago, the overwhelming question was, how can we stop the world population reaching 24 billion? After a few years, we found that our projections were near to 12 billion. Now we believe that the world, which is currently 7, will increase to about 10 by the middle of the century, and then flatten out towards the end of the century. So 10 billion, we think, will be the maximum world population. And that is because of this, falling fertility. And if there's one message that I think demographers failed to grasp last century, it was how quickly the total fertility rate would fall. Total fertility rate is the number of children per reproductive or per childbearing woman. And I don't know whether anyone here knows which country in the world currently has the lowest total fertility rate. Can anyone guess? Singapore? Very near Singapore. People usually say Italy or China. And in fact, I recently asked the question and someone yelled out, the Vatican. Well, maybe. It's actually very near. It's Hong Kong. Less than 1 child per woman now is being born in Hong Kong. Singapore is just above 1. So is Korea. The majority of Southeast Asia is coming down to below replacement. Thailand has lower fertility than the UK. Vietnam has lower fertility than Sweden. And I think it's really important that we understand why this fertility has fallen. And the reason why we should understand why it has fallen is because then we can focus on those parts of the world where we still have reasonably high fertility rates. What we've done here is map the total fertility rate, that's the number of children per woman of childbearing age. And if you look at those colours in yellow, they are those countries where they have less than 2.1, that's replacement level fertility. And if you combine that also with the brown countries, In fact, 2/3 of the countries in the world are now approaching, at, or below total fertility rate. But if you look at the red countries, they have more than 4 children per woman. And I think if you will always also notice that not only are they mainly African countries, but they are in the least developed part of the world. And I think it's interesting for us to discover why it is that fertility comes down. Because African countries still have over 4. Their fertility has not come down in the way that the rest of the world has come down. And there are some demographers who believe that in fact it won't. Now, I said that maximum world population was going to be about 10 billion. That is based on the UN median projection. And like all projections, that is based on assumptions. And you can say that demography is a science of assumptions. And it assumes that Africa's fertility will flatten and come down to about replacement level just after the middle of the century. If it does not, then Africa will not grow as we presume it will, from about 1 billion to 2 billion to 3 by the end of the century. It will actually reach 15 billion people by the end of the century, and we will have a maximum world population of 22 billion. Now, that is highly unlikely to happen, but I think it's really important that we learn what kind of interventions may be possible in order that we can help the African population reduce its fertility. And that is not only because a population of 22 billion on a finite planet would be very challenging. It's because the governments of Africa themselves realize that their development is being held back by the growing number of births, and African women themselves are realizing that they are burdened by constant pregnancies and child rearing. So I think we can say that there are 3 main camps as to why fertility falls. One camp believes it's to do with infant mortality. To put it very simply, when infant mortality falls, it is a spur to falling fertility. If you are a woman, you have 8 babies, and you realize that you're going to have to bring up, feed and rear all 8 children, you will reduce your fertility. The second broad camp believes it's something to do with family planning. And they believe very strongly that the reason why Africa has not reduced its fertility is because it has an unmet need for family planning, and that if we go out and introduce family planning programs, we will just cut fertility. A third group of people believe that it's actually around education. And this works in several ways. If you educate women, you give them more opportunities, more skills. They can go out into the labour market, and that will encourage them to reduce their fertility. But more importantly, it changes their mindset. And indeed, one of the great contemporary demographers called Jack Caldwell, he said that ideational change, the change in people's ideas, was the biggest driver of a reduction in fertility. Now, one of the key thinkers around fertility is Wolfgang Lutz, who runs the population program out of Vienna. And he is a visiting professor at the Institute, and funded by a large European Research Council grant. He is working with colleagues at the Institute and in other parts of Oxford in an international collaboration that is working to look at the drivers of fertility. And one of the real themes that is coming out of that is around education. So we can look here. This is just to map the relationship of education with fertility. This is the percentage of women aged 20 to 39 with at least junior secondary education. And if you look at the dark and light green, which represents over 80 and over 60% of the women with at least that education, you can see that maps very nicely onto those countries which have below or near replacement level. Whereas the sort of dark maroon colour and pink, that is where you have less than 20% of women of junior school education, or less than 40. But as we know, just because we see kind of an association, that doesn't mean there's a correlation, and in particular, it doesn't mean that there is a causal association. And I think this is demonstrated very nicely by this work by Matthews. This is the number of births in 17 OECD countries, and the y-axis shows the number of births, And it correlates very strongly. It's a highly significant correlation, 99% probability, with the x-axis, which is the number of stork breeding pairs, because as we know, storks bring babies, and here is our proof. So we always have to be a little careful with statistics, says the anthropologist. However, clearly there is a lot of evidence around the role of education. And I think one of the really key things is that education not only brings down fertility in the way that I described, but it also brings down infant mortality, which is one of the drivers, and it also increases the uptake of family planning, which is another driver. And we can see that this here in this study of India, which we've done in a very simple graph. This is infant mortality rates by education and wealth. You can see the y-axis shows you the infant mortality rate. We have the group on this side, which is low education, and the group on the other side, which is high education. The poor in dark blue, and the rich in light blue. And you can see consistently that those people with high education have lower infant mortality than the rich people with low education. And we can see that very nicely there. Rich, low-educated households actually have higher infant mortality than the poor ones with high education. And I can just show you this, exactly the same in Indonesia, and in fact, it's been replicated elsewhere. This, I think, is particularly of importance. This is the role of education on take-up of family planning. Remember, I say there's a group out there who believe that all you have to do is go out with your family planning programs and you will bring down fertility. No, it's far more complicated than that. We have a spectrum going across from no education to completed secondary education. We're going to look at 3 countries, Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, and Benin. And if we look at the blue lines at the top, these are the percentage of women who know about modern family planning. And you can see, regardless of their educational status, there's a very high knowledge. But if you look at usage, and usage is in the pink lines, you can see that it goes very clearly from low usage for the low-educated group up to nearly 100% for the high-educated group. So I think we now have some very strong scientific evidence which says that education is a key driver of bringing down fertility. And that is important because if we want to be able to work with policymakers and NGOs, to enable them to work with the governments and the women of Africa to bring down their fertility, then education, we believe, has to play some role in that. But of course, my lecture isn't actually about expanding fertility, it's actually about falling fertility. Is this the last century of youth? I really wanted to call the lecture The Second Demographic Transition, ? But the communications office felt it wasn't really sufficiently catchy, and I think probably it wasn't. But really what we're talking about is something which some demographers suggest is happening, and George Leeson at the Institute and David Coleman, also at Oxford, in the Department of Social Policy, have written quite extensively about the second demographic transition. And this basically says that if you have low fertility for more than one generation, you will fall into something called the low fertility trap. You have a demographic inertia which spirals fertility down. And it spirals down for 3 broad sets of reasons. Demographically, there is a momentum built up. You have less baby girls, you have less mothers, you have less babies, etc. Socially, you begin to change family norms. People get used to the fact that our society is increasingly childless or just one child. And then economically, economists are beginning to point out that younger cohorts are getting used to the idea that children are consumer goods, and that if you want to raise your consumption, you can have less children so that you can raise your material consumption. So the really big question is, are there countries in the world that are heading for a low fertility trap? Are there countries where, because their fertility is less than 1.5 for more than one generation, the norms of that society have changed? Now, we have very little empirical evidence at the moment. A lot of this is hypothesis. But we do have what we might call anecdotal evidence coming out of China. Because if you remember, China has had a one-child policy since 1981. And that means we have 30 years of one-child children. And of course, many of those are now getting married and beginning to start their own families. And interestingly enough, the little evidence we have is that when asked about expected and desired family size, they say they want one child, because that's the world they grew up in. They grew up in a child when everyone they know just had one child. And if that is the case, then people are arguing that we have societies in Europe where we have, for more than one generation, a similar fertility. We have societies beginning to emerge in Southeast Asia. And therefore, this demographic inertia, this spiraling down of youths, may well happen. So I've talked a little bit about the facts, and I've talked about the debate, and what I want to do is move on from the evidence to look at some of the implications. And I'm actually going to do two types of implications. One, I just want to show you demographic projections, and then I want to turn to look at some of the socio-economic implications. We've called this vanishing children, and what we have done here, we are, again, using the UN median population, which does have certain assumptions, but it is the middle range projections. And we are starting at 1980, and I'm just going to run this projection forward. You need to concentrate on those parts of those countries which are colored red, because they're the countries where they have less than 15% of their population as children. And you can see slowly the red moves across the globe. By 2010, you can see already we're going down into Asia, all the OECD countries, North America. By 2030, nearly all of Latin America and North America is gone. By 2050, almost the whole world. And by the end of the century, we will have almost the entire world with a percentage of children less than 15%. That means that a country like Syria, which currently has 25% of its population children, is going to drop to 10% by 2050. It means that Afghanistan, that currently has about 30% of its population children, is going to drop to nearly 10% by the end of the century. And we can run this further on. We can look at what will happen to workers. What you need to look at here is the yellow. The yellow is where you have more than 70% of your population of working age. Now, we've defined working age as 15 to 64, because that's how the UN defines it. And we can maybe come back to this in the discussion. But if we run this forward, you can see the yellow starts very quickly to disappear. The red, which is less than 60%, increases. And if we do run it to the end of the century, you can see that the majority of the countries by the end of the century will have between half and 60% of their population of working age. Now, you can actually say this is completely ridiculous, the idea that you do not start work till you're 15 and you're going to stop work when you're 64, particularly by 2100. In fact, it doesn't really even pertain in today's society. But the point is that we can change behaviors, we can have policies which influence behaviors, and if we don't, and we continue thinking of workers just in that age group, this will be the result. So what about the social and economic implications? One of the things that I think we've tried to do at the Institute is based on the idea that it's not always the answers that are important, it's actually the questions that you ask. So we've tried to reframe some of the questions that have been asked. And I think there has been an issue around the way that people have looked at aging populations. They've tended to think of aging populations being about a growth in old people, and many of the resultant burden is because of this bulge in old people, which they say will emerge in societies. And you've seen it in reports by economists and policymakers. Now, in fact, many of the changes that will occur as the population goes through this age transition over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years are going to occur due to falling fertility. That is, as the reduction in young people coming into our labor markets, our economies, and our societies. Now, economists for a long time have spoken about the life course effect. And that means that we behave in certain ways at different ages. So when we are young adults, we typically are producing, and we're consuming, and we're saving. And that's driving economies. And as we get to be older adults, that's when we produce less, we consume less, and we start to draw down on our investments. So when you have a population that has a large percentage of a particular age, that will affect the economy and the society. And I just want to demonstrate this with this paper. This is a paper by Zeng and Spiegel, and what they have showed, I think, very clearly is the US demographic trends and the impact on the US stock market. This is a long-run trend. This is from 1954 up to the present and projected beyond. Now, if you look at that, the stock prices, which is in the blue, you can see some oscillation, but you can basically see that the long-run trend, not the short cycle, but the long run, fits in very well with their age model, which is in red. In other words, in 1981, all the members of the large post-war birth cohorts had entered the American labor market. They were working, they were producing, and they were saving. And by 2004 onwards, they started to retire, they stopped saving, and they drew down on their investments. And we now have a series of these models that are occurring in different, particularly OECD countries, that are showing a very, very similar long-range impact of the changing demography. And there's some similar work has been done by colleagues in Sweden, Malberg and his team, and they have done it on residential building. Exactly the same kind of pattern. When you are in your 20s, 30s, 40s, you are leaving home, you are setting up your own home, you are getting married, you're having children, and that is pushing demand into the housing market. And then when you start to retire, downsize, and eventually die, the pressure comes off the housing market. People say, no, but isn't it all about divorce and remarriage and reconstituted families, etc.? Well, yes, it is. But what is the age group that is getting married, getting divorced, having more children, etc.? It's the same age group. We do have, obviously, divorces and reconstituted families after 50, 55, but the majority of them are happening in the same age group, that young adult age group. The final example I want to give you is this, and this is the impact on the labor market. There is, I think, probably quite serious concern emerging. Reports from the IMF, from the World Economic Forum, from the World Bank have started to express concern about the upcoming skills shortage, and particularly that Europe is not in a good place to attract skills. And I just want to show you this. This is looking at what we call the incoming cohorts to the labor market, age 20 to 24, and the outgoing cohorts, age 60 to 64, in OECD countries. And you can see that around about 2014, there will be more leaving than entering. And if I say that this includes the current estimates for immigration, so the migrants are in here, you can see why there is concern in some quarters that we will not have the skills to drive our economies. And I think what is particularly interesting is a certain type of migration that actually has been operating over the last 50 years. And that is that the old, rich countries of the Northern Hemisphere have exported human capital, economic capital, to the poor, young countries of the South in return for importing human capital in the form of migrant labor. And where have we got it from? We have got it from Asia and Latin America, and to a certain extent Africa, the very parts of the world where fertility is falling. And these countries are becoming increasingly concerned to keep their own skills. They need them for their economic development. And Manpower recently put out a report which suggested that there is one big area that is going to dominate this field, and I'm sure you're not surprised if I say that it is China. That China is the only country in the world that has mapped its occupational structure by age, and it knows at what year it's going to have a downturn in skills. And then, according to Manpower, it will do what we've been doing. It will start cherry-picking the best skills. And we do a lot of work at the Institute in Southeast Asia, and these countries are very concerned about how China may take the best of its skills. And this report suggests that then China will move to Latin America and to Europe, and by 2030, the brain drain will go from the US across to China. So if you're a bright, young graduate from Oxford University, you will not go and work for First Boston in New York. You will go and work for a bank in Shanghai. So, what I've talked about up till now has been fertility. Let's look at what is happening to the other driver, which is mortality. Now, at Oxford, we have a huge expertise in global health, morbidity, mortality in the developing world. And in fact, as the VC mentioned, at the Institute, we have a lot of research that is occurring with colleagues in Africa and Latin America. But I'm just going to talk about the more developed world when we look at mortality. What has happened over the last 150 years has been what we call the rectangularization of the life curve. And if you look at 1851, which is the black line, we've got the ages along the bottom. You can see that in 1851, we had deaths across the life course. And what we've done is push those deaths back, so that by 2011, we're almost into a rectangle. The implications of this are that in 1851, half the population didn't make it to 45. And by 2011, half the population now lives longer than 85. This, I should say, sorry, is for England and Wales. Now, obviously, there are policy implications. In 1908, when the first state pension was introduced in this country, half the population was dead by 60. In 1948, when we had our contributory state pension, half the population was dead by 72. And if you want to start playing these kind of numbers games about putting pensions with life expectancy, maybe we should go back to the middle of the 19th century, and we should look at what Bismarck was doing in Europe, because if we want the same state pension age that links into the pension age that was around when Bismarck was introducing his pension, then in the UK it would be 103. So let's look a little at what is actually happening, and I'm going to concentrate on these years, 1911 to 2011, and look and see why mortality started to fall. And again, we're going to look at what was happening in the UK. What we've done here is map UK male mortality across last century. And you can see that with the exception of the yellow line, which is cancer, we've had almost continued falls in UK male mortality. The situation with cancer is interesting because, in fact, the incidence of cancer in this country is going up, probably due to lifestyle changes, but deaths from cancer are slightly going down, probably to do with medicine. And we can also look at the green line. That is death from respiratory infections or respiratory causes. And you can see the huge peak, that green peak. This was the flu epidemic of 1918 and 1919. But generally, it's been downward. So the big question, of course, is what's going to happen here? What's going to happen over the coming decades? And I think there are two big questions that scientists are looking at the moment. One of them is around infectious diseases. And if we look at the red line, that is infections, you can see that with the exception of the two world wars where we had a peak, infections have been steadily downward, and now the number of deaths are negligible in this country from infections. But of course, I'm sure you've all seen recent reports and evidence which suggests that due to the resistance of bacteria, antibiotic resistance, we may well see a resurgence of infections. And some people have argued that we'll have infectious diseases coming back across the life course. I have to say that my colleague, Professor Angela McLean, who runs one of the James Martin Institutes, and this is on infectious diseases, she has a very different take on this. She says, or she believes, that because of the advances that we're making, particularly in the genetics, of understanding the genetics of these pathogens, and particularly in the way that we are advancing drug therapies, that we will always be ahead of the game. But it will come at a cost, and I will come back to that in a minute. The other thing to look at is obviously the blue. The blue is circulatory. And you can see again that it was actually quite steady until the 70s and 80s, and then it started to drop quite dramatically. And this has been put down to, if you like, the cessation of an epidemic of smoking. It was a lifestyle change. Work that came again out of Oxford, Sir Richard Peto, who was one of the first people to bring together the link between smoking and deaths from cardiovascular disease, and particularly in lung cancer. And the public health initiative, which brought down smoking among men, had a real impact on the deaths at the population level. So we can see here, these are deaths from heart disease, men aged 60 to 69. And again, you can see the dramatic fall from the 70s onwards. And similarly, cancer, particularly lung cancer, and stroke. Now, the really big question, therefore, is if smoking was the lifestyle epidemic of the last century, obesity is the lifestyle epidemic of the current century. And what will be the impact of obesity on life expectancy, and particularly on healthy life expectancy? Because it's actually very different. If we're going to have long-lived lives that are healthy and active, at one level it doesn't actually matter how long we live, so long as we're active and contributory. If, however, we're going to have long lives that are increasingly disabled, then it will have an impact. So I want to just talk a little bit about obesity. Oxford has 3 centres working on obesity. And I just want to show you what is happening at the moment in the States. So this is obesity in the United States. And I'm going to run this through. It's going to happen by itself, I hope. This is 1986, and you can see, actually, we weren't really collecting data in 1986. Obesity was not really a big problem. But if you run down, look at your eyes on the colors. So we're going to go from 10 all the way down. Dark blue is 15, 20% is yellow, right the way down to 35% of the state being obese. And I just want to run this through till 2009. And slowly you can see these different colors coming in. Let's watch for the first. 15% has arrived in about 1992. Yellow, 20% by 1998. We now have 25%, 30, 34%. And finally, by 2009, we have our first state that hit 35% of the population obese. Does anyone know what this state is? Mississippi. And does anyone know what the blue one is? Colorado. Now, that may well be actually a statistical error, because nobody can quite work out why Colorado has so levels of obesity. But it could be. I'm sorry if there are people here from Colorado to help us. But you can see the impact that obesity has had in a very short period of time. Now, this is of particular concern to American policymakers in particular, because America has a far lower than expected life expectancy. If we look at OECD averages, America is below the average in OECD countries. So there is a growing area of interest, which is backed by some excellent research, which is trying to say, is one of the reasons why America's life expectancy not keeping match with other countries in the OECD because of its obesity? And I just want to show you this study, which looks at the prevalence of obesity in a variety of OECD countries, and then see how we can use this material to answer that question. So the US is the highest, but look, Spain and England, this is just taking females. We have about 30% of women aged over 50 in our country who are now obese. And then look at Japan, very high life expectancies, highest in the world, very, very low levels of obesity. So what I'm going to show you here is an attempt to answer that question. This is the effect of obesity on female life expectancy at age 50, and we're comparing 2 studies here. The sort of turquoisey green, that is the prospective studies collaboration, which was run out of Oxford, led by Sir Richard Peto, and it looked at studies of obesity from 1979 to the mid-1990s. And we're comparing it with the Mehta-Chang study, which started in the 1990s and went through to 2006. And what this table shows, again, if we just look at the US on this side, it is saying that if we did not have obesity, then we could, in the PSC study add 1.6 extra years of life onto female life expectancy. That may not seem many, but if you think that over the last 50 years, US life expectancy has risen by 4.3 years, a loss of 1.6 is significant. However, the Meta-Chang study, which looked at obesity a complete decade later, suggests that it's much less. So people have tried to understand why this should be. Obesity is growing, but deaths related to obesity appear to be going down. Now, of course, obesity in itself does occasionally, but very rarely kills, but it leads to diabetes, and it also leads to cardiovascular disease, strokes, and cancer, which do kill. And one of the theories that they've come up with is actually this, that it is increasing use of drug therapies which are counteracting the effects of obesity. And I think that's a really important factor. We can say that smoking was reduced through public health initiatives which got men to stop smoking. Now, ideally, we want obesity to be reduced by initiatives that basically stop us eating so much, stop us drinking so much, and stop us using exercise. So taking exercise. Makes us take exercise, sorry. But what people are suggesting, particularly in the States, is that maybe we're moving to a culture where rather than having healthy lifestyles, we actually can, if you like, just pop a pill. And that has all sorts of implications, particularly, again, for the cost of healthcare. And again, I will come back to that in a minute. Before I do, I want just to move on to a study that we did, which I think stresses, again, the importance of healthy lifestyles. This is work we did at the Institute on nearly 2 million occupational pension records, and we have in there 500,000 deaths. And we can look, therefore, at real life expectancies. And here we have put this material into two groups. We have our low group, that's low income, ill health retiree, unhealthy lifestyle. At age of 65, these people would have a life expectancy of 12 years, compared with our second group, which is high income, normal health retiree, and a healthy lifestyle. And they would have a life expectancy of 23 years. So an 11-year difference between the UK population. Now, this is not actually that surprising. We've had the Whitehall study, a much smaller study, but it came up with very similar findings. But you can see here the impact. This is the proportion of 65-year-old men expected to survive to each older age. Compare the green, which is our unhealthy group, with the blue, which is our healthy group. And you can see, particularly here in the 80s, the considerable increase in difference in life expectancies. Now, this is a study which, because it is so large, it has quite considerable power. So what we've been able to do is look at the impact of different factors on longevity. So at the top, we've got our poor group, manual employee poor, unhealthy lifestyle, ill health retiree, 12 years when they retire of life expectancy. But if this man had retired in normal health, it's 1.8 years. If he'd had a healthy lifestyle, it's another 4.6 years. If he'd had a high income, it's 4 years. And interestingly enough, the difference between manual and non-manual occupation only adds in 0.7. In other words, healthy lifestyle, independent of income, adds on more than income itself. So promoting healthy lifestyles, a public health initiative, it worked in this country last century against smoking. It clearly has the potential to work this century against some of the lifestyle ills like obesity. So finally, let's move on very quickly to look at this, because people are becoming increasingly interested in this idea of radical longevity. That is the idea that we might live for 100, 120, 150 years. And there are three types of science which are trying to tackle this. There is regenerative medicine, there is age retardation, and there is disease control and cure. And I think, to be honest, despite whatever claims you read in the press, the real advances that are made from age retardation and from longevity work, regeneration, etc., probably are going to have a limited impact in the near future. But the second one, and that is the simple way in which we're trying to control and cure diseases, potentially could have a huge impact. The new genetics, nanotechnology, and particularly this, stem cell research. Now, stem cell research has been very controversial. At the moment, we have three broad ways of using stem cells. We have stem cells which come from the adult itself, from the bone marrow, but they, on the whole, can only treat disorders of the blood very successfully, but a very limited treatment. We have embryonic stem cells, which has huge controversy ethically, and also huge issues around rejection. And then we have this. And this is based on some more research that is happening at Oxford, again, out of the Oxford Martin School. Our Institute for Stem Cell Research is working on this new system whereby you can take an adult cell from the skin and you can reprogram it to make it pluripotent, which I understand means you turn it again back into a stem cell and you then can place it back into the human body. And there is now a growing collaboration which is working very successfully in this area of science. And one of the reasons why I think this is so important is because this has already gone through research, it is already out there in therapy. And as Paul Fairchild, who is head of the Institute of Stem Cell Research at Oxford, has said, I don't work in regenerative medicine. I'm not interested in lengthening people's lives. I'm interested in alleviating suffering and curing disease. But I recognize that in doing that, I am going to increasingly lengthen the lives of people. So we can put all of this together and move on to the implications of this falling mortality. There's recently been tremendous interest in the subject of centenarians. My colleague George Leeson is one of a growing group of people who are looking at the new demography in a slightly different way. The old way of doing demography was very much based around ideas of actuarial and life tables, but there's a new group that are trying to build the kind of science I've just showed you into their forward-looking projections. And if I say that my colleague produced for a government conference some projections of centenarians across the century, and we all said, you're wrong, this cannot be right. And then ONS brought out this a couple of weeks later. You will see what this century is going to herald. What this suggested was that by the middle of this century, we currently have about 10,000 centenarians in this country. By the middle of this century, ONS DWP have projected there will be nearly 500,000 centenarians. And by the end of the century, they are projecting that the UK could have heading for 1 million centenarians. And that means that there are about 1.6 million people over 65 who will make it to a century. There are 3 million people under 16 who will make it to a century. And this fits in very well, not only work from here in the UK, but projections that we're getting from people like Oshansky in Chicago, from Varpel, who is working out of the Max Planck Institute. And they are saying things like half the baby girls who were born last century in Europe may well live in 3 centuries. And that means that my daughter, who is 15, has a really good chance of making it to 100 and living in 3 centuries. And that means that Varpel's projection of the life expectancy for the 2007 European birth cohort is 103. So, long lives. What, however, will be the implication of the falling mortality and the increasing long lives? And I want to talk about this because this is the thing that I think is concerning most people. It's going to be the costs. And I don't know whether you recently read the IMF report, which predicted that the aging of the world population was going to bring a financial burden which would be 20 times the burden of the current global crisis. And if I say that there is a growing body of academics who are becoming increasingly skeptical about this, This is because research, I think, is showing that the age factor on these costs has been highly overestimated. And in fact, some work that came out of the Health Economics Department at the University of Oxford, which was a meta-study of OECD countries, suggested that in only one country was age alone the explanatory effect. In all others, it was high-tech medicine, the kind of way that medicine was delivered, and in particular, the growing demand for drug therapies and high technology, which goes right back to the obesity story. The use of drugs to conquer something that maybe we could do by changing our lifestyles. And I just want to illustrate this argument. This is not going to demonstrate it, it's going to illustrate it. What we have here is health expenditure as a percentage of GDP between 1960 and 2009, and I really want to compare Japan, which is that zigzaggy line under the red, and the US, which is the line that's going upward. And you can see very clearly that in that period, the US went from 5% of GDP to about 18, whereas Japan went from about 2 up to about 6. Now, was it because of the aging of their populations? We can compare how old these populations are. The percentage of over 65s in the US went from 9 to 13%, whereas in Japan it went from 6 to 23. Something else has been driving up these healthcare costs. And how effective has it been? Again, let's look. Increase in life expectancy as our measure of effectiveness. At age 65, the US put on 4.3 years, Japan put on 8.6 years. Here we have a highly medicalized society that spent an awful lot of money, but actually hasn't had the same impact as Japan, which has tended to go much more for things like lifestyle, and particularly to care for its older people in a more holistic way. So far, all the implications that I have spoken about have been economic. And I want to start concluding by looking at more social, cultural implications. And I want to look at two things to do with falling mortality and increasing life expectancy. The first one is generational succession. And this says that our societies are built around a particular way of operating, which is that generations pass down wealth and power and assets down through the generations. And we're used to this being passed down through 2, 3, maybe 4 at the moment generations. What happens when we have societies that have 4, 5, 6 generations alive and active at the same time? What happens when you don't inherit from your parents till you're 80? Or from your grandparents until you're 80? What will happen to our workplaces, our political systems, as we have these increasingly long, hopefully active and productive lives? I recently did a radio phone-in, and a woman rang up, and she said, "I'm 75, my brothers are in their 80s, and our mother will not die." Now, it was a very obviously sad thing to say, but her point was, my brothers are in their 80s, they will never be head of the household. They will always have the mother over them. And I think there's becoming increasing interest in the way that we are going to have to change our societies if we are going to have long-lived, active, productive generations. And this leads very nicely into the second thing I want to mention, which is about the life course. This is, I think, a wonderful statue. I believe it's at Euston Station, but it represents the 7 ages of man. If we are going to be living not for 70, 80, or 90 years, but maybe for 100, 120 years, are we going to have 7, 8, 9, 10 ages of man? Or are we going to start stretching out each of those independent ages? I spoke a few years ago to the City of London Boys' School, and I thought I was going to be addressing sixth formers, and when I turned up, there were 80 boys ranging from 12 to 80. And I thought, how am I going to talk about, 12 to 18. How am I going to talk about this to such a broad and relatively young audience? So I split them into 2. And I said, on this side, you're going to live till you're 150. And on this side, you're going to live till you're 50. Now, bearing in mind when you're 12, 50 is completely sort of over the hill. I wasn't sure if this would work. But a little boy on this side put his hand up. And he said, if I'm going to live till I'm 150, I'm not going to start having kids till I'm 80. Now, that actually was just the right way of thinking, because what is very clear is we're seeing something called the aging of life transitions. While we live in societies that may be bringing down the age at which we can legally do things, we can vote younger, have sex younger, drink younger. However, we as individuals are delaying those transitions, delaying leaving home, delaying getting married or forming a union, delaying having children, delaying having a permanent job, delaying buying houses. Now, obviously, there are other social factors affecting it, but we also have the luxury of knowing that we can wait to our 40s to have children, and we probably still will be active parents and grandparents for those children. So the aging of life transitions, I think, is a very important future way in which our lives may change. And I think they also may change in another way, where we have an increasing amount of research, which is asking the question that, do we want these long-lived lives to be in the boxes that we have at the moment? That we are educated, we work, and then we have a period of leisure? Or do we want to have more fluid lives across these long life courses? So let's conclude. We've looked at what is happening with falling fertility, the debate, the evidence, some of the implications. We've looked at what is happening with falling mortality, debate, evidence, and some of the implications. How do we begin to put this together? And I think the way that we need to look at this is through this. It's the generational contract. And there has been a large amount written about the changing generational contract. This is something that most societies has, and it's built on the idea that generations will look after older generations, look after younger generations, because there will be reciprocity when they themselves become older. In other words, parents look after children. As the children grow up, they care for older parents. It happens within families. It happens within societies. That's why active adults pay taxes to look after both young children through education and older adults through pensions and long-term care. One of the questions that I think increasingly we should be asking is, should the current generations who are entering later life pay for the success of their own mortality and fertility? They have been successful in reducing their fertility, and that has given them added consumption in other areas. They've been successful in reducing their own mortality, and that has given them long, healthy lives. And in which case, we should be talking about an adapted generational contract. But if we do go that way, then we are going a way that not many societies have trodden before. So finally, the title of my talk was 21st Century, Last Century of Youth. And without any doubt, demographically, we are seeing some big shifts. Within about 10 years, there will be half of Europe's population aged over 50. We've never had a region of the world where half the population is aged between about 50 and 100. In about 20 years' time, there will be more old people in Asia than young people. And currently, globally, we have more people over 65 than under 5. What is going to be the implications for the young people who are living in this kind of a world? Now, I think that no, we're not going to have a world where youth is going to vanish, but I do think we will have a world where youthful demography will stop. Never again will we have that pyramid, young people coming into our societies and our economies and driving them. We will move much more to a skyscraper. And what about the position of the young in this new world? We've heard so much recently about the burden of the aging generation, this idea of generational burden, generational inequity, the generational pinch. If we say to our young people, yes, throughout your lives, you're going to be following this generation above you, which is taking all the opportunity and resources away from you, then, in fact, their ambitions will be narrowed. But if we say to young people to be part of a diminishing cohort is actually very positive. We talked earlier about the skill shortage. We know that there will be a global demand for skills. And with smaller cohorts coming behind, if those cohorts are willing to educate and to travel, then they will have huge opportunities. So I think the message is to our younger generations, you will be better educated, you will have better health, and you will have greater access to communications than any generation before you. You will be able to choose more than any other generation has where and how you're going to work, whether you're going to have children, how you're going to live your lives, and they're going to be longer than ever before. Because then if I think we say that to our young people, then indeed their horizons will not be reduced, but actually to be young people in a world of diminishing youth will give broader horizons than probably any other generation that has preceded them. Thank you.